When most Americans think of the Cold War, they picture Berlin Wall dividing East and West. They think of nuclear missiles in Cuba, spies in Moscow, or tense summits between Washington and the Kremlin. But what if I told you the real battlefield of the Cold War wasn't in Europe or the Caribbean, but in Africa? From the dense jungles of Congo to the deserts of Ethiopia and the plains of Angola, Africa became the stage where the world's two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, fought for dominance. Not through open war, but through proxy conflicts. These were wars fought by local armies, but funded, armed, and orchestrated by global giants pulling the strings from thousands of miles away down to Washington and Moscow. These were chess games, moves on a global board of ideology. But to millions of Africans, they were wars that shattered nations, toppled leaders, and left scars that remain to this day. This isn't a conspiracy theory. What you're about to hear comes from declassified CIA documents, KGB archives, and first-hand accounts from diplomats, soldiers, and historians. Because while textbooks in the US teach about the Cold War as a battle for Berlin or Korea, few mention that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Africa was where the Cold War turned hot. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover how secret American operations, Soviet military airlifts, and Cuban troops turned African independence movements into some of the most brutal proxy wars in modern history. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why this chapter of history was buried, why it complicates the heroic narrative of freedom versus communism, and why the human cost of this forgotten battlefield still shapes the continent today. Because the Cold War wasn't just fought in the shadows of Berlin. It was fought in Congo, Angola, and Ethiopia, and the world has yet to reckon with what really happened there. In 1960, the heart of Africa exploded with hope and chaos. After nearly a century under Belgian colonial rule, the Congo declared independence. The nation was rich in copper, uranium, and cobalt, all minerals the world desperately needed in the nuclear age. And leading this newborn country was a young, charismatic Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba believed independence meant more than replacing white rulers with black politicians. He wanted real sovereignty, control over the Congo's vast natural wealth, freedom from foreign domination, and unity for his divided nation. But his dream quickly collided with Cold War reality. Washington was watching closely. To the Eisenhower administration, Lumumba's nationalist message and his willingness to accept Soviet aid looked like the beginnings of a second Cuba, a communist foothold in the very center of Africa. In an era obsessed with containment that was unthinkable, behind closed doors, CIA analysts labeled Lumumba a dangerous man. Within weeks of Congo's independence, the CIA launched one of its first major covert operations in Africa. Money, weapons, and political support began flowing, not to build democracy, but to undermine it. The agency funneled cash to Lumumba's rivals, backed secessionist movements in mineral-rich provinces like Katanga, and supported Colonel Joseph Mobutu, a young army officer with ambitions far beyond his rank. Then came the darkest chapter. In December 1960, Lumumba was arrested by Mobutu's forces with CIA approval and logistical help. Weeks later, he was handed over to his enemies in Katanga, tortured and executed. His body was dissolved in acid. The CIA station in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, reported success. The communist threat had been neutralized. Mobutu Sese Seko soon emerged as Congo's ruler. He promised stability, fought communism, and opened his country's minds to American corporations. Washington rewarded him with billions in aid. For the next 3 decades, Mobutu ruled as one of Africa's most infamous dictators, enriching himself while his people starved. The lesson was clear. During the Cold War, stability mattered more than democracy. The Congo became a blueprint, a model for how both superpowers would shape Africa's future, through coups, covert operations, and proxy wars, all in the name of ideology. But this was just the beginning. Because in the years that followed, another African nation would become the stage for the largest and bloodiest proxy war of the entire Cold War. If the Congo was the CIA's first secret experiment in Africa, then Angola was the continent's full-scale Cold War battlefield. The year was 1975. After nearly 500 years of Portuguese colonial rule, Angola finally achieved independence. But freedom didn't bring peace, it brought a power vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped three rival factions, each claiming the right to rule the new nation. On one side was the MPLA, a Marxist movement backed by the Soviet Union and later reinforced by Cuban troops. On the other was UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, fiercely anti-communist, armed by the CIA, and supported by the apartheid government of South Africa. The third faction, the FNLA, also received early American backing, but soon faded as the conflict escalated. To the outside world, Angola's struggle looked like a civil war. But beneath the surface, it was something far larger, the biggest proxy war on African soil. Washington feared that a Marxist victory in Angola would hand Moscow control over the Atlantic coast of southern Africa, a strategic nightmare. The U.S. funneled millions of dollars in weapons, intelligence, and training through covert channels. South African troops crossed the border from Namibia to assist UNITA, while Zaire's Mobutu sent arms and men, encouraged by the CIA. Then came a shocking twist. In late 1975, Fidel Castro made a bold move that stunned the world. Without Moscow's initial approval, he sent tens of thousands of Cuban soldiers, not just advisors, but combat troops, across the ocean to fight for the MPLA. Their mission: to stop South Africa's advance and secure a Marxist government in Luanda. It worked. Within months, Cuban tanks and Soviet artillery pushed back the combined forces of UNITA and the South Africans. By early 1976, the MPLA controlled the capital and most of the major cities. The Soviets supplied the weapons, Cuba supplied the manpower, and Angola became one of the most militarized nations in Africa. But the war didn't end, it only evolved. For the next 15 years, Angola became a nightmare of Cold War contradictions. The United States, the self-proclaimed champion of freedom, found itself indirectly allied with South Africa's apartheid regime, supporting a military campaign that left tens of thousands dead. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Cuba justified their intervention and anti-imperialist solidarity, even as the fighting devastated the very people they claimed to protect. By the 1980s, Angola's civil war had become one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in the world. Entire towns were erased. Landmines littered the countryside. And both superpowers, the US and the USSR, continued pouring in money, weapons, and propaganda. Long after the ideological cause had begun to fade, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, Angola was still burning. The war had killed more than 500,000 people and displaced millions more. The superpowers walked away, leaving behind a nation in ruins and an entire generation that had never known peace. Angola proved one grim truth. In the Cold War, victory didn't depend on who was right, but on who could survive the longest. While Angola burned in the southwest, another Cold War fault line was about to erupt in the Horn of Africa, a betrayal so swift and shocking that even seasoned diplomats couldn't believe it. The year was 1977. The U.S. still considered Somalia an ally. For years, Washington had supplied the Somali regime under Siad Barre with weapons, training, and economic aid. Somalia's position along the Red Sea made it strategically invaluable, a gateway to the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. But history was about to turn upside down. To the west, neighboring Ethiopia was descending into chaos. Its ancient monarchy had just been overthrown by a group of young Marxist officers called the Derg, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam. The new regime was brutal but ideologically clear. Ethiopia was now officially Marxist-Leninist, and that caught the attention of Moscow. At the time, the Soviet Union was already backing Somalia. But when Somalia launched an invasion into Ethiopia's Ogaden Desert, claiming to unite ethnic Somalis under one flag, the Kremlin faced an impossible choice: stay loyal to its old ally, or back the new Marxist revolution. Moscow chose revolution almost overnight. The Soviets abandoned Somalia and switched sides. They cut off all aid to Syed Barre and poured billions in weapons into Ethiopia. More than 15,000 Cuban soldiers were airlifted into the highlands, supported by Soviet pilots, tanks, and artillery. The U.S., blindsided and hesitant under President Jimmy Carter, had no quick response. Within months, Somali forces, once confident of victory, were crushed. The Ethiopian army, bolstered by Soviet logistics and Cuban firepower, pushed them back across the border. By early 1978, the war was over, and the red flag flew over Ogaden. It was one of the most dramatic realignments of the Cold War. The Soviets had proven that they could project military power across continents almost overnight, establishing a global air bridge from Eastern Europe to the Horn of Africa. For Washington, it was a humiliating wake-up call, but the human cost was staggering. Villages in the Ogaden were flattened. Refugees flooded into Kenya and Djibouti. In both Somalia and Ethiopia, famine and repression followed in the wake of war. The U.S. soon began courting Somalia again, not out of sympathy, but out of strategy. Hoping to counterbalance Soviet influence in the region, the Ogaden War revealed the brutal calculus of Cold War diplomacy. There were no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Ideology was just a mask. The real game was control of territory, of shipping routes, of influence. By the end of the 1970s, the Cold War in Africa had drawn in nearly every global power. The result was not victory or freedom, but a continent littered with weapons, dictatorships, and generations traumatized by wars that were never truly their own. When the Cold War finally thawed in the early 1990s, the superpowers moved on. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was gone. Washington declared victory. But in Africa, the war never really ended. The United States and the USSR had used African nations like chess pieces, and when the game was over, they simply walked away, leaving the board in ruins. What remained were millions of lives destroyed, economies shattered, and governments built on corruption and violence. Across the continent, the human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that the various proxy wars in Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Somalia, Congo, and beyond claimed more than 5 million lives. Tens of millions more were displaced, their homes and villages obliterated by conflicts that were never truly theirs to begin with. But the suffering didn't stop with the fighting. When foreign money stopped flowing and the Cold War headlines faded, the weapons stayed. Soviet rifles, American mortar, and landmines became the inheritance of a lost generation. In Angola alone, it's estimated that over 10 million landmines were left buried, silent, killers that still maim civilians to this day. Then came the economics of chaos. Without the ideological cover of communism or capitalism, local warlords and militias found new ways to profit from destruction. They traded in blood diamonds, oil, and rare minerals, financing new conflicts long after the Cold War was over. What began as an ideological struggle between democracy and Marxism had devolved into something colder, a system of exploitation built on greed and survival. And the environmental scars were just as deep. Angola's fields, once fertile, became graveyards of rusting tanks. In Mozambique, forests were leveled to fuel armies. In Congo, rivers that once symbolized freedom became dumping grounds for industrial and chemical waste from decades of warfare. For the people of Africa, the Cold War's end didn't bring liberation. It brought abandonment. The superpowers withdrew, taking their aid, their media attention, and their promises with them. What was left were fragile governments, ethnic tensions, and economies too weak to recover. Decades later, the echoes of that forgotten battlefield still shape the continent. Civil wars in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo trace their roots directly to Cold War interventions. Corruption, authoritarianism, and foreign exploitation remain legacies of that same period when ideology masked imperial ambition. And yet, in most American classrooms, this story is barely mentioned. Textbooks speak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin airlift, the space race, but not the African wars where millions died in the name of the Cold War. The silence is telling. Because acknowledging these proxy wars means acknowledging that America's role in the Cold War was not always heroic, and that democracy was sometimes sacrificed. For the sake of strategy, the Cold War may have ended in 1991, but in Africa, its ghosts are still alive in the landmines that maimed children, in the broken economies that never healed, and in the unmarked graves that tell a story the world chose to forget. When Americans think of the Cold War, they think of victory, the triumph of freedom over tyranny, of democracy over communism. But history is never that simple, because beneath the headlines of nuclear brinkmanship and speeches about liberty, there was another war, a hidden Cold War, fought far from Washington and Moscow, on a continent that neither superpower truly understood. In Africa, the Cold War wasn't about ideology. It was about control of land, of resources, of influence. The US and the Soviet Union poured money, weapons, and propaganda into nations still struggling to define their own identities after centuries of colonialism. They called it strategy, but for millions of Africans, it meant civil wars, coups, and decades of suffering. It's easy to forget these stories, because they don't fit the neat narrative of good versus evil. They remind us that, in pursuit of victory, even the most powerful nations can lose their moral compass. The story of the Cold War in Africa is not just about what happened. It's about what was chosen to be forgotten. So here's the question. Why don't we talk about this in American classrooms? Why isn't it in our history books that US money-armed rebels who fought alongside apartheid forces, or that the Soviet Union turned liberation movements into authoritarian regimes? Maybe because it complicates the story we tell ourselves, that we were always on the right side. But real history isn't about comfort. It's about understanding. And to understand the world we live in today, the wars, the poverty, the corruption that still grip parts of Africa, we have to confront this forgotten chapter. The Cold War wasn't just fought in Berlin or Cuba. It was fought in the jungles of Congo, the deserts of Ogaden, and the battlefields of Angola, where millions of people paid the price for a war they never asked to fight. These are the stories that deserve to be told, not to shame, but to learn. Because if we ignore the truth, we risk repeating it. If you found this history lesson important, hit like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories from the hidden corners of the Cold War. The past isn't over, not until we understand it.